How did white people become white people? I'm so glad you asked. I find that most white people have no idea how they came to identify as white.
White people, they exist from Caucasus Mountain. That is why they are called Caucasian. And then in the Caucasus Mountain, in the Pale next to Greece, that's where they were created, and they were a genetical interbreeding species that were created by a particular ancestor within our family members.
Point number two, it has been a common belief in theory that has been proven to be false that the Homo sapiens started evolving the light-skinned gene around 40,000 years ago, but yet they couldn't produce one Caucasoid past the age of 7,000 years.
The whole history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. It starts in the colonies of what would become the United States. Let's remember, during the colonial period, mid-1600s, there was no such thing as white people. I know some people who are now called white find that shocking, right?
To understand the origin of white people, we must start with the fundamental truth. All humans share a common origin in Africa. Homo sapiens first emerged on this continent around 300,000 years ago, carrying the genetic blueprint for all the diversity we see today.
How did white people become white people? I'm so glad you asked. I find that most white people have no idea how they came to identify as white. And because they don't know that history, they often fundamentally misunderstand the push against whiteness and white supremacy. You see, white people didn't exist before the middle of the 17th century, as in the middle of the 1600s. And if your mind immediately went to the year 1619, then you're on to something. More on that later. And this isn't to say that lighter-skinned people didn't exist. Of course they did. Europe is a real place with real people. But those people didn't identify as white people. They were Englishmen, Dutch, Germanic, Slavs, Greeks, Gauls, Scythians. Princeton history professor Dr. Nell Irvin Painter chronicles the invention of this diasporic pan-European white identity in her book, The History of White People. She demonstrates how white identity was constructed primarily as a justification for the enslavement of African people. Whiteness was from the very beginning constructed to be the antithesis of blackness. Enslavers needed some moral and philosophical cover for what they were doing to African people. And so the myth of whiteness, moral purity, superiority, ruling destiny was born. And as such, whiteness is and always has been a political identity, a fraternal order, a loyalty rewards program that depends entirely on all of its members agreeing to maintain the myth. And even though this myth has been thoroughly debunked, many are working overtime to this very day to maintain its power. Like and follow for more.
White people, they exist from Caucasus Mountain. That is why they are called Caucasian. And then in the Caucasus Mountain, in the Pale next to Greece, that's where they were created, and they were a genetical interbreeding species that were created by a particular ancestor within our family members. That particular ancestor was so jealous and envious that he was not welcomed by that community of the day, and then he created his own species. In one of the legends, that ancestor is known as a deform. That is taught by as a deformist, someone who's not well formed in human nature. This legend is taught in Ndaba My Children by Baba Credo Mutra. That famous legend. That is why I'll allude unto it. It talks about Zareri, and Zareri being protected by Nelisa, and Nelisa was warned by the Kariba birds that Nelisa, what you're going to give birth, it's a pure evil that will be destroying the world generation to generation to come. So Zareri was destroyed because of that, after all the incident. But he was born, and when he was born, he get to attribute his powers through building technology. That is where we get technology in Africa, and they knew about technology. We knew about that, and we had warnings that we don't have to have technology, because the coming back of technology will be a doom of our nation, or a doom of our civilization or life here, inhabitants. It will be transformed. Hence why there's a changing in this Aquarian era. So Zareri created his own species, and his own species were called Abanju, were called the Doja, or the Gandu, or the Mavara. They were entertaining Zareri as the king of that species. You can get it into Ndaba My Children. It's a second version of the story after being told of Mama and Smagate, the creational story of Baba Credomutu.
Point number 2. It has been a common belief in theory that has been proven to be false that the Homo sapiens started evolving the light-skinned gene around 40,000 years ago, but yet they couldn't produce one Caucasoid past the age of 7,000 years.
Hello, my friend. So there are a range of issues with this claim. Aside from the fact that this 19th century style categorization of skulls is inherently problematic, the oldest Caucasoid appearing skull isn't just 9,000 years old. I think what you're referring to is the Kenwick man found in the Americas. The oldest appearing European-like skull would belong to the Cro-Magnons, and they're believed to have entered Europe from the Middle East around 56,000 years ago, making them the oldest anatomically modern humans to enter Europe. The oldest Cro-Magnon skull intact enough for us to analyze its shape is around 32,000 years old, but other remains believed to have belonged to the Cro-Magnons date back to around 40 to 50,000 years. It's also important to note that modern skulls are not going to appear identical to skulls from tens of thousands of years ago. Our bones are continuously changing and adapting. The same way a human skull found in Africa from 200,000 years ago isn't going to be exactly the same as that of a modern person in Africa.
The first humans lived in Africa and almost certainly had dark skin. This was an amazing biological adaptation that our ancient ancestors had inherited. It allowed them safe access to the sunny savanna grasslands of Africa where our species first showed up on the global scene. Their dark skin protected their skin cells from the damaging and harmful effects of UV radiation. So how was it that our dark-skinned ancestors, at the earliest dawn of our time in a remote region of Africa, how did our species go from there to occupying just about every habitable patch of land on Earth and featuring a diverse array of skin colors? To answer that, let's track human migration on a journey from Africa out into the world.
The whole history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. It starts in the colonies of what would become the United States. Let's remember, during the colonial period, mid-1600s, there was no such thing as white people. I know some people who are now called white find that shocking, right? Because they think whiteness is real, right? But whiteness was created. Europeans didn't call themselves white. We didn't call ourselves white. We weren't all members of one big happy family. Are you kidding? Have you studied the history of Europe? The history of Europe was about killing each other. That's what we did in Europe. We just killed each other before we figured out there were other people to kill. We just killed each other, right? I mean, that was the history of Europe. The English hated the Irish, right? Northern Italians didn't even think that Southern Italians were Italians. The Germans hated everybody, and everybody hated their ass right back, right? There was no team called white, no race called white, but all of a sudden, in the middle of the 1600s, there was. Why? Why was it suddenly necessary to create this thing called the white race? Well, because rich people can count, that's why. And so rich folks looked around, the ones that owned all the land, you know, in the colonies, the colonial elite looked around and they realized something, that they were heavily outnumbered by African enslaved folks, by European indentured servants who were just one level above a slave, or other Europeans who weren't technically indentured servants, but they were still peasants, didn't have any money, didn't have any land, and they could do the math. They added it up and they were like, damn, we got to figure out a way to split these folks apart from one another or they're going to rise up and take our stuff, right? Because after a while, these black folks who were enslaved Africans and these quote unquote white folks who were poor Europeans are going to figure out they're all getting played by these rich people, right? So ultimately the rich figure out they got to come up with some way to get somebody in that group on their team. The easiest thing is to get the poor Europeans, right? Because at least they look like you. They sort of share some of the customs and the culture. So they all of a sudden create this thing called whiteness and they say, now you're part of the club. Now we're going to let you testify in court, enter into contracts, vote, at least if you're a man, own a little bit of land, at least if you're a man, right? And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. No more of that, because you're too good for that. And we're going to take the white men, now called white men, and put them on the slave patrol to keep black people in line. Give them a horse and a gun and a badge and make them feel big and powerful, right? They're still poor. They still don't have anything. They didn't pay the slave patrol well. Right? Just exploited them, used them as a buffer between the elite and the other poor folks, particularly poor folks of color. And pretty soon the rebellions that occasionally happened where black and white got together to overthrow the elite, those stopped because the divide and conquer had begun to work, right? You could turn people against each other by telling those poor white folks, they got to keep these black people in line. And so that divide and conquer gets initiated in the colonies. Rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. Fast forward to the Civil War era. And you have, I'm from the South, right? My people, the elite in my part of the country, right, actually announced that the reason they wanted to break away from the Union and possibly go to war with their brothers and sisters to the North was in order to maintain slavery and white supremacy. They said that at the time. We lie about it now. And we say it had nothing to do with that. But of course, at the time, they didn't have any shame about it, so they just said it openly. Right? The vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, said that the cornerstone of the new government was the great truth that the Negro was not the equal of the white man. So that's the reason the Confederacy was formed and existed. But here's the trick. If I'm rich and I want to go to war to protect my ownership in other human beings, my property, but you're poor and you don't own any enslaved people, why the hell would you go fight to protect my stuff? Because I'm a rich person. I'm not going to fight. Rich people don't go to war. Right? Rich people get poor people to go to war for them, whether it's in 1860 or whether it's during the 1960s or whether it's today, right? Rich folks get doctors to write notes for them that say that they have heel spurs and that's why they can't go to Vietnam. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, you can Google that shit because he's sitting in the White House right now, right? Oh, I can't go fight. I have heel spurs. Send some poor kids to do that for me, please, right? So that's been a long-standing tradition. So the rich have to figure out a way to convince the poor to go fight for them. But that's a hard thing. That's like a hard sell, right? Like, how the hell, why would you do that? Why would you go fight to protect my property rights when you don't own anything? The only way you would do it is if that rich person comes to you and says, hey, listen, you gotta go fight because we gotta maintain our way of life, because if these people get free, they're gonna take your jobs. No, fool, they already got your job. That's how it works, right? Because if I'm white and I got to charge you $1 a day to work on the farm, but you can get a black person to do it for nothing because you own them, guess who got the job? Free got the job, right? So in a sense, poor white folks would have been better off joining with black folks to overthrow the slave system. That would have raised the wage floor of all working people. But they got tricked by rich white men telling them that their enemies were black and brown. Fast forward to the 1930s. And you have white labor leaders. They're not even the elite, right? The labor leaders are not the elite, but they're the elite within the labor movement. And even they had fallen for it at this point. So they didn't want to integrate their unions. And they would say things like, well, we can't have black people and Mexicans and Chinese folks in our unions because if we do that, it's going to reduce the professionalism of our craft. We have to maintain the integrity of our profession. No, fool, you need more people in the damn union is what you need. And if you don't let those folks in, guess what happens when you go out on strike? Who is the boss going to use to replace you? They're going to replace you with the very same black and brown folks that you didn't want to work next to, right? And so at the end of and then you're going to blame them for taking your job rather than the white rich dude for giving it to them, right? Divide and conquer. Telling not rich white folks that their enemies are black and brown. And now we fast forward to the president. We got the president of the United States becoming president on the basis of that same rhetoric. Telling not rich white folks that the reason they don't have a job is because Mexicans took them.
What happened to the 12 tribes of Israel? Where did they end up? And why do I think we all have a little bit in us? Let's look at my handy dandy map, shall we? This is kind of based on the Bible and words of places and whatever. So this is a rough guess. Probably accurate, but let's go with it. Okay, so we got Dan, who ends up going north, like Russia, Scandinavia area, ends up the whole Viking thing, Ireland, Scotland. Also think that he ended up in China and Japan because there is some J haplogroup over there. Though he might be the I haplogroup because that is a common one up there, but he would have blended in with the sons of Japheth, as do the rest of them. If we look at Benjamin, they suspect that after getting kicked out of Israel, now we're talking Judah and Benjamin, end up getting stuck in Italy. And then we got Judah ending up over here and Benjamin possibly ending up in Germany. So Ephraim and Manasseh, one of them ends up in Great Britain. I'm kind of guessing maybe some in France. Reuben and half tribe of Manasseh end up in France. We know that the Brits would go down to Sicily, the Normans, and whatever. So I'm putting them down here too. But because kings descend from, like Manasseh and Ephraim, I'm feeling like And we have France over here. A lot of kings descend from Charlemagne. So either Charlemagne got a little of both, maybe a little bit of Reuben, maybe some one of her, Manasseh. That would explain that. And Ephraim, I'm kind of feeling Africa. I'm also feeling that because kings came out of China too. And the first emperor wasn't until they got booted out 3,000 years ago. And it wasn't until 200 something BC that the first emperor of China was there. So it's like 700 years. Plenty of time to blend with the locals and having that in your blood, right? Now we come over here to the States. So remember that Judah's in Spain and Spain conquered down here. So we know that there is Sephardic Jew in the Spaniards. And so that would end up down here. We got some Ephraim, Manasseh up in here. Reuben's blue, right? And in Canada, we have Ephraim and Manasseh as well. Some German, for sure, Pennsylvania area. Definitely, that's kind of where they settled. Also like Ohio, Illinois. So I got Benjamin up in there. But as you can see, population spreads. And it is Bible prophecy that they would be spread to the four corners of the earth. So this looks good to me. As for the other tribes, I don't know. Okay, I suspect some of them ended up in Middle Eastern regions, possibly Africa, Asia, and other places in the world. But that kind of covers the four corners of the earth, right? Like the Bible prophecy says. Another interesting thing that I found when I was looking into this was when migrating to Europe, both the Parthians and those from Scythia retained the name Saxon, which stands for Sax or Isaac's sons, as they made the Great Britain their new home. This name, however, was also retained by the former people of Israel who remained on the European continent, for example, Saxony in Germany. The Scythians, descendants of Japheth, you're getting a little tribe of Manasseh and a little tribe of Ephraim, blending in with them, and then heading over this way. And that's kind of how that all hooks up.
How did humans evolve such various skin tones, including the lighter pigmentation associated with white people? Let's explore the science. Skin color is a remarkable adaptation to the environment. Melanin, the pigment in our skin, protects against harmful UV rays. In regions with intense sunlight, such as Africa, darker skin evolved to protect against UV damage and preserve essential nutrients like folate. As humans migrated out of Africa into Europe and Asia, they encountered environments with lower UV levels. Over tens of thousands of years, lighter skin evolved as an adaptation to synthesize vitamin D efficiently in regions with less sunlight. Research into ancient DNA has revealed that early Europeans were not uniformly white. For example, the first farmer in Europe who arrived from the Near East around 8,000 years ago had darker skin. It was not until later, with the spread of genes associated with lighter pigmentation, that white skin became prevalent in Europe. These genetic changes were influenced by natural selections and interbreeding between migrating populations, including hunter-gatherers, farmers, and even Neanderthals. The environment also played a role in shaping the features commonly associated with white populations. Ice Age conditions in Europe influenced traits such as egg texture, eye color, and facial structure. These adaptations were not just biological but intertwined with cultural and social evolution. It is important to emphasize that race is a social construct. While genetics explain physical adaptations, they do not define intelligence, behavior, or worth. Humanity's story is one of shared origins and interconnectedness. Studying the origins of white people or any population is not about division, but about appreciating the incredible adaptability of our species. Every skin tone, features, and trait tells a story of survival and ingenuity. Our differences are just chapters in a shared human story, one that began in Africa and continues to this day. The origin of white people is just one piece of the puzzle in the broader tapestry of human evolution. Thank you for watching. Do not forget to like and share your thoughts in the comment box below. Until next time, cheers and have a good one.